Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the 8-Bit Adventures podcast, bringing you the latest and greatest geeky news of the week. I am your host, Sean Hayes. Unfortunately, my wonderful co-host, Courtney Bolin, is under the weather this week. She's got some migraines going on, so she will not be joining us. But yeah, what are you going to do? So I wanted to make sure that we did get a show out just because we didn't have one last week because I was under the weather. So yeah, it's that time of the year. Everybody's sick. Everybody's got stuff going on. So we've got a couple items this week. Some exciting news, some spicy news going on. A lot of little controversies going on, and then for our deep dive, I want to talk about what's going on with Tales of Jamora, which is both our Dungeons and Dragons podcast that's been on hiatus kind of since COVID started, as well as the setting that it's based on, and just some news surrounding that, and then just a quick wrap up on Questlog. So, without further ado, let's hop right into quickfire news. All right, so first up, Blizzard of Activision Blizzard, quote-unquote, acquires the roughly 200-person Vicarious Visions based in Albany, New York. So I say quote-unquote acquired because Vicarious Visions was also part of Activision Blizzard. But they've kind of been rolled into Blizzard to work specifically on Blizzard properties now. So they'll be working on presumably other projects similar to possibly there's rumors that there's like a Diablo 2 reforged quote unquote that this could be leading up to, but basically they've got a track record of doing remasters of games that have turned out pretty well. They did the Tony Hawk remasters, and those did fantastically. So, yeah. Also, to throw that in there because they're fairly local, and they're kind of a bigger developer. And so we don't kind of see that in our area. So that's kind of noteworthy. And then in other Blizzard news, February 19th and 20th is BlizzConline, which is a virtual showcase that's kind of going to take the place of BlizzCon from 2020. A terrible name. Just right off the bat, terrible name. But they're going to do stuff, their big showcase events and talk about what's going on, what's new, releasing any new information about upcoming stuff. One thing of note is apparently in like a financial call or like a financial meeting or something, there was no indication that Diablo 4 or Overwatch 2 are coming in 2021. So we might not see them until 2022. Next up, CD Projekt. So more controversy surrounding these Cyberpunk developers. They got hacked, and the folks that hacked in acquired source code, internal memos, HR documents, and source code for a few of the games, including Cyberpunk, Witcher 3, Gwent, and like a supposed unreleased version of Witcher 3. And were holding it for ransom, or that they would just like release it onto the internet. According to various news sources, CD Projekt has no intention of paying said ransom. So we may see that come out in a few days or so, assuming that the hackers actually have that code. So yeah, again, just one thing right after another for CD Projekt. Relogic, makers of Terraria, said they are canceling the Stadia version of the game after they've been locked out of their Google accounts for several weeks with no explanation from Google. So they said, well, if we can't get any support to fix this, we're done. So that's, it's another problem that has happened. And speaking of Stadia, Google announced last week that it's shutting down its internal development division for the platform. And instead, it's going to focus on third-party partners. Really focusing on that partner aspect to it. So it kind of sounds like that it's just going to be a cloud gaming service that will provide servers for other companies to do cloud gaming. So whether or not that is a heavy blow to the whole concept of Stadia, I don't know. But it's certainly visually, it does not look good because it kind of just feeds into the narrative of Google has these grand ideas. They put a nominal effort to get it out. Seems to be, ranging from halfway decent to great, and then just kind of abandoning it if it doesn't fit into sort of their advertising mold. One of the things I guess it wants to focus on is like having it be like a cable package, where a bunch of different games will be rolled into a bundled service. So whether that flies with these third-party partners, quote unquote, or not, we'll have to see. Next up, so this week, Friday, February 12th, Super Mario 3D World and Bowser's Fury is released for the Switch. So this is sort of a Wii U port, plus additional bonus content in the form of Bowser's Fury. So we did talk about it a little bit on previous episodes, but that is releasing this week. You can pre-order it now and pre-download it. So, and I will be playing it on my 8-Bit Adventures Plays streams this week, as that was voted on. So we'll be able to. So for those that didn't get a chance to see it on the Wii U, you'll be able to take a look at it now. One thing I don't know, and I don't know if it's been touched upon, is whether the Bowser's Fury content is post-game or is separate, so that you could just jump right into that and play that instead of playing through the game. I don't know. And then last up, kind of a surprise announcement today, is we are getting a sequel to the Sonic the Hedgehog film, aptly titled Sonic the Hedgehog 2. It's gonna, so far, has a tentative release date of April 8th, 2022. And all we got in the little teaser for it was sort of the title, in which the 2 has 2 tails, to indicate it will have miles per hour, affectionately known as Tails, in some aspect, and it was playing a sort of remixed, remastered track from Sonic 2. So that is going to wrap up our quickfire news for this week. So we're going to switch gears and go into our deep dive. Okay. So, Tales of Jamora, our D&D show that's kind of been in hiatus for a while. Still going to be in hiatus, unfortunately. That's due to the situation with the TV station, and COVID, as well as the situation with rural communities not getting high-speed internet access in Western Massachusetts, unless you are lucky, basically. So it's still on hiatus for a while longer. I would very much like to get to play D&D again soon. But it's those barriers kind of prevent being able to do anything in the interim. So what I've been doing is I have been working on a campaign guide that patrons on Patreon have gotten some behind the scenes looks, and My hope is to get a rough draft done by the end of the year. We'll see how well that does. There's going to be a lot of changes for those that are familiar with the show, familiar with the setting from the show. There's going to be quite a bit, just from listening to a lot of other TTRPG creators talk about doing stuff and writing stuff and how to write better, how to write settings better, how to write adventures better, how to not fall into problematic tropes and things. So there was already sort of a shift happening while the show was still running. But this is going to mark like a pretty big tonal shift as well. One of the things I haven't discussed yet with the cast, and will be something that we decide if and when the show returns, is whether we shift things on the show or not. Now I say this because the show right now is kind of it's what a lot of D&D kind of is right now, where it's sort of high fantasy, but also a little Renaissance, but also a little steampunky. It's like kind of Warcraft / Zelda-esque, because it takes influences from that. But it's not necessarily like the sort of Dark Ages sword and sorcery that older editions of D&D were kind of looking at. But it's also like it's not quite Eberron, it's not quite Forgotten Realms. Certainly not like Ravnica, although Ravnica is probably the closest in terms of like technology. So I've been doing a lot of thinking, and some of the things that I think about are like what makes a setting unique, what would get people interested in a setting, what do I want out of writing a setting, what do I want out of creating a setting, what do I want out of this game, out of this show, and things like that. And so there's going to be a major shift in tone. So it's going to shift from that to basically a science fantasy. And you could argue that the game already and the show kind of already fit that bent. But we're going to take a look at it more as a little bit of like a retro aesthetic. Okay, so like retro modern. So it's not going to be necessarily medieval castles and feudalism and knights holding sort of like being a part of the gentry. I'm not even sure if I'm using the right words, but I mean, so there will still be emperors, there will still be queens and kings, and elements of that, but to give it a little bit more of like an 80s aesthetic, and still have it be fantasy, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this, and we see this a lot with Japanese RPGs, right? There's a lot of them, especially ones that are rooted in fantasy, that have modern elements and still blend them seamlessly with fantasy elements. And even in stuff that like we don't necessarily consider fantasy. So like Pokemon, for instance. Like Pokemon has all sorts of very modern elements, like lots of computer technology, but at the same time, like, you see like the police officers ride on motorcycles, but for the most part, like they don't really talk about cars all that much, which is interesting, right? So, aside from the whole like you can find Mew under the truck sort of thing, like so there is this, so they do exist, but it seems to be uncommon. And so kind of thinking about things like that. Um, so to take like a 1980s vibe, combine it with elements that are inspired from sort of this modern fantasy or retro fantasy, we'll call it. Um, and to get like what I call for the elevator pitch, right, is a D&D campaign that encompasses Zelda and Chill meets Magic Sword, right? So you've got lo-fi synthwave, lot heavy fantasy inspiration, so that you can do your swords and synthwave, um, and to give it a different vibe, right? So things that it'll still have are it's still gonna have like there was this ancient civilization. Um, so the relic forged are still gonna be a thing. That are basically robotic individuals that get rebooted every 100 years or so. Um, you're still gonna have the gods. I trimmed down the deity list, and you have there's a couple different sort of religions. So there's ones that are a little bit more organized, some that are a little less organized. Um, and so the pantheon, quote unquote, is sort of like the older religion that sort of more rural areas may practice, and there's like a little bit more organized ones. Um, Also factoring in communities might worship archfey, you know, especially if they are in communities that have a fey influence. Um, or they may pay homage to primal spirits as a sort of like earth worship type of thing. Um, but also now thinking about if we're going with this sort of aesthetic and this vibe, doing like magical technology, kind of like Eberron does, um, but thinking about like the Industrial Revolution with magic, and if you have magic, what don't you end up using? And like the big thing that came to my mind was, I mean, if you have magic that can do stuff that provides combustion, can strengthen materials and everything, or make things elastic, I mean, do places end up drilling for oil? And likely not, right? So what is a world what is a like a 1980s world look like without oil and without petroleum products? And what replaces that? And also thinking about what are some of the ugly aspects of that era that we want to better, because this is fantasy, right? So this is a world that you want people to live in, that you want your players to want to live in, right? Um, so things like Reaganomics, no. Like what does 1980s look like with completely socialized healthcare? Uh, with the thought being, I mean, you might using the quote unquote alignment system, which for the show we do not use because I don't really like alignment. But it's a common trope for D&D players to understand, and an audience familiar with D&D to understand, Dungeons and Dragons to understand. Um, if you are someone that um, had the willpower, had the education, the tenacity, and the cunning to get to a station where you're in charge of an empire or a large nation, uh, it does not matter necessarily if you are lawful good or if you are neutral evil. Um, you are going to want to do things like to keep things stable and to keep your populace happy, because if your populace is happy, they're much more likely to support you, right? And much less likely to question things that you do. Especially if you are the person that is enacting these policies. as opposed to like a council or a senate or something. Um, so basically, the idea is that uh, care is available to everybody if they wish to have it, right? That it's just part of being a citizen of many of these kingdoms. Now, whether there's access or not, and I bring this. So I will say I am I have a lot of privilege, right? Middle class, white, cishet dude. Um, I went to a little Ivy League school, quote unquote. Um, so I have a lot of privilege. So there's a lot that like I haven't experienced. Um, but what I can talk about is what it's like to live in a rural community in the United States. Um, Especially communities that still lack basic infrastructure. Um, and communities that are losing infrastructure. Because a couple years ago, one of our community hospitals closed, like due to lack of funding. Um, and we're still feeling the effects of that. Like it's sort of become like a satellite hospital that kind of exists but kind of doesn't. Um, so these are things that I think about is like focusing on in the larger cities. Sure, there's a plethora of services that are available, and if you can make it to a city, like yeah, there's you can get all this, healthcare. There's all this wondrous like art and culture and food and like wild diversity of ideas and technologies and all that stuff. But like once you kind of get out into the rural areas or wilderness areas, then you might be reliant on what's available or not available. And you might still have to rely on wilderness medicine and things like that. Um, so just because the overall technology level of the world will be much higher than it currently is in the setting doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden now all of the problems are like you just don't have any of the problems that you would normally encounter in a Dungeons and Dragons game. Um, some of the other things is the book and the show. For game mechanics terms, we're going to be using lineage instead of race. Um, just because Wizards has finally indicated that it's going to kind of move in that direction a little bit. I kind of like lineage a little bit better than folk, which is what I've been using. I do like it a little bit better than ancestry. Um, and the book is going to have culture as a thing that you tack onto your character, right? So culture is going to be basically everybody that comes from like a nation or a region where a kind of culture is dominant. One of the things that I'll put in the book is like there are subcultures as well. Just like we have in real life. How um like you could say there is a dominant culture in the US, but there are plenty of subcultures as well. Um that when you make a character, you might fit better into a subculture kind of a thing. But the goal is to apply cultural traits to your character. And the idea is it'll provide a bunch of like proficiencies, not skills, but like tools, maybe weapon proficiencies, maybe like maybe bonus languages, and then there'll be a mechanical benefit that is typically like it'll be mechanics, but it is intended to have a little bit more of a role playing flair to it. Um, Now I say this so like it's or situational, so that it's not just like you're not just gonna get dark vision, right? But you might get like if you're from Twillin, you might get you ignore the penalty to perception for dim light, just because, and your viewing distance in fog and mist is doubled, just because you have to contend with fog and mist all the time when you're in that nation. Like, it doesn't matter where you live in that nation, you have to contend with it. And you have just become accustomed to dim light because that's how it kind of is there. Whereas your lineage will provide sort of physical, biological traits. One of the other things is going to be going with just the flat +2/+1 to ability scores. And that's your choice, right? Because you are an adventurer, you are an exceptional, you are a player character. Sorry, I got a cough drop in my mouth. And that you are not bound. Like, they're in to move away from stereotypes. And if there's going to be physical traits that get emphasized, there are ways to do that without being problematic. And there's a couple things, in the player's handbook in particular, or in other books that they talk about as either cultural traits baked into quote unquote race, or traits themselves that have names that give negative connotations. Things like savage attacks, menacing. One of the things that I haven't seen talked about a lot, but I know I've seen outside of the context of D&D is quote unquote natural athlete. So it basically do work around things like that. And just try and redo it. Make it better. I mean, that's the goal. Is when you release a mod for D&D, which is what a lot of stuff that ends up on DM's Guild is. It's, mods and extra rules and everything. It comes from a standpoint of this is missing, or this can be improved. And that's ultimately the goal with this here. So yeah, a big portion of the book is going to focus on the cultures, because it's essentially a game guide, and so that's what you want to focus on. You want to focus on the setting itself, and sort of what makes it special. I'm particularly interested in things like art and music and food, clothing styles. So there's going to be a lot of that stuff. Leisure activities is going to be big. I haven't put any of that in because it hasn't made it into the first draft, but leisure activities are going to come around, like sports, right? Especially if we're going to be doing a big shift in time period. Sports play a big part in what's going to be a pseudo fantasy 80s culture. And so what kind of games and sports are played? What is the just sort of social culture like? What do people do after is school taught in like a 8 to 2, 7:30 to 2, like 7:30 to 2:30, 8 to 2:30? Like, what do you do after school? Thinking about, I mean, so if TVs are a thing, what gets broadcasted? Are there sports that are particularly important enough that they broadcast those matches? Sort of like the Olympics. Is there like an international set of games that kind of like might serve as like a nationalistic thing that takes place of warfare, or serves as serves as a theatrical analog to warfare? Um, I don't know, you know. Um, but also thinking about things like one thing that I think D&D has a problem with, and Forgotten Realms in particular has a problem with this, um, is the concept of you become so powerful, you are a godlike figure if you get high enough level. And assuming that heroes are non-unique, like if a problem comes up and it's a big earth-shattering cataclysmic problem, where are all the other heroes? Right? Like, where are the other like deific heroes? What are they doing? So I've thought about this a lot, and this can kind of be applied to general D&D. Is eventually, once you get high enough in rank, your problems go from save the world to there are now cosmic problems. Um, and we can kind of think about this in like a superhero um, thought process as well. Like we'll take Marvel as an example because they have Endgame and they've got the whole cast of people and everything. Is so you in terms of power, if you equate power ranking to levels, this means necessarily you might have bigger characters that actually have like lower levels because they're just lower on the power ranking because they're just like superhuman, but they're not like alien to the point that they have supremely superhero, like superhuman abilities. Sort of like the difference between like Captain America and Thor, right? Um, or Hulk and Thor, or Hulk and Iron Man, or Captain Marvel, or Doctor Strange and everything, right? So if you think about these sort of sphere of problems that you deal with at different power levels, with Jamora, my plan is a default assumption of this setting is that uh, not really to have a lot of, we'll call them terrestrial NPCs that are super high level. There might only be a handful in the world. And due to the way the setting is structured, they might all be the leaders of nations. And the reason is, once you get up to a certain level, you start to become aware of other realms. and the word realms is going to be used in the book instead of like planes, just to give it a little bit of a different feel. So it'll be like the realm of fairies instead of the Feywild. This is also to make sure it's in compliance with OGL. So you start to become aware of different realms, and you start to become aware of different problems in other realms. And generally, the other realms are pretty dangerous to any sort of material or terrestrial inhabitants. And there's a lot of problems that bleed over into there, particularly the realm of fairies, because one of the nations, Lilinosti, was founded from elven immigrants that came from the Feywild. But when they did, it was like an emergency evacuation, and they punched a hole in reality. So now that there's like this bleeding of the realm of fairy in the fairy kingdoms into the material plane, and it's been forever tainted, right? So that stuff gets weird, and that what would normally follow natural, quote unquote, natural physical laws don't necessarily apply. So you get problems like that. So now you become aware of those problems, and now you have to take care of those problems. Now suddenly, you know, if there's a seedy duke who's overcharging taxes, it's like, I mean, that's a problem, but you know, that's gonna, like, if we solve that problem, it saves a town. Whereas this other pressing matter, like, this affects like 3 or 4 different realms of the multiverse, and that's a bigger problem. And so powerful heroes have to solve bigger problems. So what this means is that you always have lesser powerful heroes um, going around solving these smaller problems. And that's why smaller adventuring parties might run into other smaller adventuring parties, maybe not necessarily running into like giant superheroes because they're always off world. Or to take a little bit of inspiration from like Dragon Ball Z, is if they're gonna do some fighting on the material plane, they're going to try and lure those threats out to a location where they're going to try and cause as little collateral damage as possible. Which means that you won't see it. um, this also means that you could play it up for really dramatic effect by having such a threat show up in a populated area. And in theory, like having your own, sort of grandiose superheroes then show up. But for the most part, like, they have to be off taking care of other problems. Um, and it's basically the Captain Marvel issue that they had for Endgame, is they had to figure out how to have Captain Marvel be in the film and not just have it be over, like, right. Pardon the you don't really call it a pun, but like the snap kind of a thing. But that you you don't want to just have more powerful characters just show up and save the day. Like, it's a Deus Ex Machina kind of a thing. Like, you want to make sure that if you're going to have such characters, that you give them reasons for not just solving all of the problems in the world, all of the time. Um, and basically that's the idea. And especially like for level like 20th level characters, they really shouldn't be solving a lot of problems just in day-to-day Jamora. Uh, they should be like solving like divine matters, or extra realm, extra planar matters. Uh, and working to keep such threats away from the general populace. Um, so yeah, so that'll be, I don't know if it'll be a sidebar or something like that. Um, but it's I just thinking a lot about games that I've played, games that I like, um, and really wanting to put in the work is what this boils down to, and why like there's been such a shift is I've started to put in the work. Um, and as I learn things, it's learning that what I had was was okay. I had done a lot. I put a lot of detail into things, but hadn't really thought about why did I want to do certain things or whatever. Or if I had thought about it, then looked at the reasons, and the reasons might have been off. Particularly like the older iterations of Jamora had, plenty of nations where you had castes and certain races were always stricken to certain castes, with the intent on being that the players as heroes should want to upend that structure. And that's a good sentiment, but it's a bad idea. Because it reinforces sort of harmful structures that we have in real life. And when people want to play a fantasy game, they don't necessarily want to deal with the garbage that they have to deal with in real life. So it's taking a look at that stuff and saying, I mean, sure, I have this. How can I make it better? Because it can always be better. And so, I mean, one of the big things we'll have to decide if and when the show comes back is, do we want to just update it? Do we want to have some sort of in-game event that happens that causes the update? Do we want to just say this is how it was all along? Surprise? I don't know. I don't know. It's a tough thing, especially since we don't know when the show's coming back. To be perfectly honest. So yeah. But yeah, so basically and plus it's a neat thought exercise to think about what would a sort of high fantasy 80s like high fantasy I don't want to say romanticized, but like it's reimagining the positive things about the 80s. And because it's fantasy, being able to say we're for a setting, for the background, we're gonna solve the bad problems that happened. Or we're gonna look at things that were bad about that time period and tweak them to make them work a bit better. While still, having, we'll call them reasonable issues. And I speak of, mostly the rural versus urban type thing. So yeah. So sorry I rambled on with that, but I know it's always tough doing a solo cast without people to bounce stuff off of. If you have any thoughts, leave them on social media. At 8-Bit Adventures or /8-Bit Adventures, Facebook, Twitter. You can email me, Sean, SEAN, at 8-bitadventures.com. If you have any feedback or any thoughts. One of the things is I don't want to take unsolicited sort of ideas that you would want to put into the book, just because that always like if you suggest like, oh, what would be cool is if you had like this god that was in charge of this stuff and everything. You always hear like writers don't want people doing that, because then it like if you end up doing something similar from an original thought that you had, now it creates a thing of doubt and you could get sued. But if it's just to talk about like, hey Sean, um have you looked at this stuff? Or these resources might be helpful. Or have you thought about this in terms of the 80s, or did you not consider this portion of stuff? So yeah. One thing, there will be subclasses. There will be lineages custom to Jamora. There will be magic items. There will be NPC stat blocks. There may be some of NPCs that folks that are fans of the Tales of Jamora show are familiar with. And obviously cultures and the cultural stuff will be in there. So there will be options for players. Oh, and new equipment. So obviously some of the stuff is, again, thinking about if the Industrial Revolution was done with magic and slash alchemy, what is different? So, there will be some element of firearms in the book, but they might not be, what would be consistent with a quote unquote 80s setting. It might just be a more efficient form of Renaissance stuff. I don't know. Like that's slightly magical or something. These are things that I'm talking about or that I'm going to be thinking about. And my ultimate goal is to enlist some help in thinking about things like this. Mostly from the cultural stuff like art, music, food, etc., etc. And using money that I've kind of squirreled away from Twitch, from Patreon and stuff to pay people, because paying people is important for their time. So, all right, I've rambled on enough for that. Why don't I go ahead and switch over to Questlog. Okay. Sorry about that. So, Questlog, so we talk about what sort of stuff we've got going on, what are our goals, what goals have we accomplished, from kind of like a nerdy, geeky perspective. So, I have my perennial color comics, create item icons, and my Get That Turtle Spirit in World of Warcraft Shadowlands. I've completed 2 out of the 3 of those things since last episode. I don't want to say since last week, just because I didn't do anything last week creatively, just because I wasn't feeling well. But this week I did get a comic colored and redid an icon for my video game project. But that turtle spirit is still so elusive. I just can't get it, it seems. Especially now that I'm running out of the spirits that you have to incubate to get it from. Running out of those, as well as running out of the type that I need for those. So that is proving to be a new challenge. So yeah. Courtney did update her goals and basically get ostriches. She did get a dinosaur egg and get cooking in Stardew Valley specifically. So she's still working on those. One thing to mention is sort of, I don't really have an alert, but smite. We'll do a little joke at smite there. Programming note. So starting February 21st, I will be adding a Sunday night stream starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or Eastern Standard Time when it rolls back to Standard Time. That is specifically for Stardew Valley. So I will be starting a new farm, new save file, and it's going to be Stardew Sundays. I've got a new overlay just for that. So that'll be exciting. It'll be just you can plan on Stardew Valley every Sunday, and it'll be a nice chill stream. Do farming, and I've got a couple surprises in store for people. A couple ideas, things that I don't normally do when I do a playthrough. Although we will be doing the community center, we won't be doing JojaMart because that's just awful. So, uh, so that'll be starting up on the 21st. Um, Likely for the rest of the month will be Super Mario 3D World streams on 8-Bit Adventures Plays, at least until the 26th when Bravely Default 2 comes out. And we may switch over to that. But it depends on what patrons and Twitch subscribers vote on. So if that's something that interests you, you should consider becoming a patron or subscribing. But with that, that's going to wrap up our show. So if you want to see more content from 8-Bit Adventures, you can check out 8-bitadventures.com. Let's see if I have... Nope. Okay. I don't know what the Nightbot command is. But over there at 8-bitadventures.com, there's the 8-Bit Adventures webcomic, which started this whole thing. There's artwork, my portfolio, there's VODs of streams, podcasts, and more. So go check that out. That is the hub for everything. Also has the streams, the content schedule, as it were. If you would like to help support that content, I already mentioned you can become a patron at patreon.com/8bitadventures, or you can subscribe right here on Twitch. Patrons can, number one, vote on what games get played for 8-Bit Adventures Plays. They get early access to the 8-Bit Adventures comic. At higher tiers, you get access to behind-the-scenes content for Tales of Jamora, and a discount on merchandise. Twitch subscribers get access to our cool emotes. We are still trying to work on unlocking more emotes. So we just have the base amount available right now. But they also get access to the weekly poll. And big shout out and thank you to everybody that supports. That supports basically this show, this content, and all that stuff. It's a big help. So, and finally, our opening theme is One Up by Professor Shy Guy. If you would like to check out more of his work, please do so at professorshyguy.bandcamp.com. And with that, we're done. So, as always, have fun, everyone. Happy gaming, and enjoy your pie cake. Good night, folks.